Hello and welcome to HiveTV's Debate Room. I am Tara Smith, and today we will be discussing voting and whether or not it should be mandatory. Our debaters today are Mr. Andrew Hanch, arguing the positive, and on the negative side we have Ms. Sarah Walters.
Well, there are several disadvantages. Right now, one of the major disadvantages, in my opinion, are the practical issues. For example, I don't think that we have, our voting system isn't currently equipped to handle the rush of voters that we would have if we instituted mandatory voting. Also, right now, Congress can't pass it. And I don't think that our court systems are set up to be able to enforce the laws if we were to pass mandatory voting.
Well, obviously in a democracy, if a democracy is built on the people's vote and the people's opinion, the more people that you would have voting, the more beneficial to the health of our democracy. I would say that one of the other advantages is that we have these major issues that need to be solved in our both local, state, and federal venues, and currently less than 20% of the people are making decisions on some fairly major issues. So my feeling is that if we make everybody vote, we can spend less time and money on advertising, and for the health of our democracy, it's just a great thing to have more people participate.
Well, that's a really good point. I also wonder if having mandatory voting would cause even more kind of negative advertising and misleading advertising, because arguably there would be more uneducated voters if it's mandatory to vote, and so the politicians and the candidates would be advertising for a mass of people that are relatively uneducated or unfamiliar with foreign policy or economics and things like that. Say you go to vote for the president, a presidential election, and you know who you're going to vote for. Maybe you've researched the top candidates and the parties, but a lot of times people go and they vote for the president, but they really don't know anything about the other things that are being, that are up for vote at that time. And so a lot of people will just select the names that they've heard before because they haven't researched those. They have researched the presidents. And I think what most Americans fear is socialism and communism, and the idea that that education and therefore then mandatory voting would become kind of paternalistic and a requirement, a duty, as opposed to a right or a freedom.
Some other things I could think of would be what would be the penalties for those folks who chose not to vote. And I think this would be very important, perhaps as in one of these other 40 countries, and I think a number of them have experimented with different things like fines, that a person could choose not to vote, but then that they would pay a fine and they could use that money for such things as public advertising, so that it would be in the government's interest to let all politicians have some amount of funds so that they could promote the real ideas and issues as opposed to negative advertising, which is kind of what we're getting with these super PACs and special interest groups these days. One of the other penalties I can think of that we would have to implement in this process of increasing voters would perhaps be community service.
You can tell that in the discussion of mandatory voting, there are pragmatic issues and there are theoretical issues. And so when we're talking about, does that make our country more communist? Is that the right thing to do? That's a theoretical debate. But then right now we're kind of talking about the pragmatic issues. And I concede, I agree with Mr. Hanch's point that there are disenfranchised or historically disenfranchised groups that are less represented right now, and probably part of that is the pragmatic problems with voting. I'm not against the idea that we want more voters. I think everybody in a democracy should want more people to vote.
And sometimes, we have to be forced into things that we don't necessarily want to do, and the end consequence is that it ends up benefiting all of us.
Well, Thank you for joining us today at the HiveTV debate room. Tell us what you decide.
So if I change the word from force into inspire, would you agree with me that government should inspire everyone to vote?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Semantics matter, people.